Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Fran Riley, Executive Director of NLA. Earlier this week, NLA announced the 2021 Awards for Excellence in Journalism. And before we begin, I just want to give a quick shout out to everyone who entered and to all the winners and finalists, and to our board member and awards committee co-chair, Allison Gerber, who's on today's panel. Allison noted that this year's entries showcased the value of news organizations to expose societal failures and hold the powerful to account. Today's session, Crime, Mugshots, and Takedown Requests, is representative of that work. So during the session today, you can enter your questions in the chat function, which our program director, Rachel Weiss, will be monitoring. And also want to let you know that this program is being recorded, so you can always check it again on newsleaders.org next week. Your program moderator today is Deborah Dwyer, a fellow with the Reynolds Journalism Institute. Welcome, Deborah. Thank you, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Fran. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I've been looking forward to having this event for, let's see, 5 years now, when I stood in the newsroom at the Chattanooga Times Free Press and told one of our panelists today, Allison Gerber, that I was going to go back to school to get a doctorate to do research on the types of issues that she and other newsrooms were having and needed some help to fix. And so unpublishing was one of those. And after years now of researching the topic and working with newsrooms, we're here today, and Allison's on the panel, and it kind of feels like we've come full circle. So I'm really excited about having this conversation and continuing the conversation. So I wanted to share with you one piece of my research, some new research from a national survey of U.S. adults that I just conducted, and I'll be sharing more of this, but we found that 81% of respondents felt that journalism organizations needed to have standardized practices when it came to what they either altered, obscured, or removed from their websites. And we have some other great information, but I think it's important to say that that expectation is there, and we're not there yet, obviously, as an industry, but I do believe that we're probably on our way, and these kind of discussions are going to help. So one little housekeeping item before we start, which is terminology, just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. Unpublishing or takedown requests has kind of become the umbrella term for a variety of issues that are associated with people contacting your newsroom and wanting something about their past typically removed. And not available to show up right on Google because it's hurting them with a job or relationships, some part of their present day life. And often these are related to crime, which is part of why we're having this discussion today. But literally unpublishing is only one action that you might take based on someone's request. If you choose to act on it, you might anonymize that person's name in the content, you might obscure it from Google search results, or you could remove it. So there are several actions that you might take, but we talk about all of that under the unpublishing or takedown request dilemma. So just wanted to get that out there. And then, as Fran said, we'll be managing the Q&A through the chat with such a large group. So, and then at the end, I'll share a resource with you where you can continue this conversation, because if I know this topic at all, I know that typically these conversations continue and continue. We could continue to have them all day. So without further ado, we'll introduce our panelists. So first up, Allison Gerber is the editor of the Chattanooga Times Free Press, my old stomping ground. And Allison serves on the board of the Newsleaders Association, as Fran said, as well as the Tennessee Coalition for Open Government. And then we have Margaret Holt, who is standards editor at the Chicago Tribune. Margaret serves on the Mid-America Press Institute board, as well as she's a member of the Native American Journalists Association. Then we have Greg Lee Jr. from the Boston Globe. He is Senior Assistant Managing Editor, Talent and Community. and he's a former president of the National Association of Black Journalists. And then last but not least, Chris Quinn, who is the vice president of Advance Ohio and editor of Cleveland.com. And he's probably been talking about this publicly for sure about the longest of anybody in the room, likely. And he's the recipient of a very exciting grant that's going to help advance our efforts in this area. And so I'm excited to get him to talk about that a little bit. So before we open it up to questions, I'd like to just pose a question to each one of you and have you just talk a little bit about your programs, because they do range from everything from looking at pre-publication practices or reporting practices, as well as what we are choosing to potentially take down or unpublish. So Allison, let's start with you. I know last year, the Times Free Press decided to dismantle its mugshot gallery, Right to Know. And then on top of that, you've also started drafting some new crime policies as far as what is reported in the first place. And I know we're looking at those together. Can you share a little bit about your ideas about those policies? And two, I'd be interested in you talking about how you've navigated that discussion with reporters in the newsroom who may have differing opinions about what should be reported today.
Right. So one of the reasons we took down our mugshot gallery was because we felt like we felt like it wasn't rising to the level of what we do in journalism, where we reach out to people and get both sides of a story, or we attempt to do that. And we were putting the onus on the people who were arrested without ever reporting on the circumstances of their arrest to contact us and remove them. And we were only removing the ones of people who actually contacted us, which were typically people who had hired high dollar defense attorneys and had, the collateral and the agency and, the team behind them to know that this was even a possibility. Mm-hmm. So it seemed really unfair on many levels. But along with that decision, we started, and along with an unpublishing committee we started talking about pre-publication standards for crime. And this is something that is still in the works. We haven't publicly unveiled it, but we've sort of done what I would call a soft opening within the newsroom. And, we have had some, what we're kind of agreeing to is only reporting on crimes when we commit to following them through disposition, so that we never just report on an arrest, even a sensational arrest, or even an arrest that's going to be newsworthy and that people are going to look at and read, if we don't follow it, all the way through the court system and report on how that ended. We feel like in an era when one mistake can follow someone around for their entire life and prevent them from obtaining a job and, hurt their ability to support their family. It's not a fair thing to only report on an arrest, which newspapers have done for many years. And then we're kind of thinking about some standards around the types of crimes we report on, felonies versus misdemeanors, and something like that. And to answer your question, Deborah, there is definitely some disagreement within the newsroom. There's some people who think, well, if it's newsworthy, we should just write about it. And there are others who think that we should be more deliberative about how we decide on what crimes to report on. So it's an ongoing discussion, but it's definitely something that, I think is important, and we have to come to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm. I look forward to seeing how those evolve. So that's going to be interesting. I'm sure we'll be writing about it for future columns for RJI. So, okay. So Margaret, let's move over to you. You have publicly announced some changes specifically about how you use booking photos and mugshots. And I was hoping you could share some of your thought process behind that. I know that you were being very deliberate now when you use them, as well as you are sunsetting them, I believe, or removing them from your site automatically after about 30 days. You're also removing them when you come across them, correct, in your archives, as well as you've invited others to alert you when they find them on your website. So this is a decision, my understanding, across the board, not particular types of crime or anything like that. Can you talk about y'all's decision and how you came to that?
Yeah, as for many organizations, it's a process and it's been very much evolutionary. And this is, of course, all the unpublishing things are related. Specifically, the mugshots, the booking photos, which I prefer to think of them as the booking photos, because those are the ones that I think have the most implicit bias and deserve the most attention, because they really do dramatically affect our commitment to be fair and balanced and equitable in the coverage of these particular criminal activities. But in the past, I think the default has always been, oh, we've always done it this way. Because those were available, we ran those things. And the last 3 or 4 years have really prompted most of us to rethink that and to take a different look at it. And I think the standard for us, the biggest difference is to flip the narrative. Instead of saying that the default is, well, we have it and it's important to tell all the stories, the default now is to examine it in the same way we examine all of our journalistic decisions. We've always done it this way, does not cut it. And so the default is now, instead of assuming that we're going to use these booking photos, let's have a conversation about it. It needs to be a major crime. It needs to be something that is of some significance. It's not the run-of-the-mill 2-sentence kind of police item. And I think that's an important distinction. And also that to use those things, it doesn't mean we won't use them, but they need to have really significant news value, and they need to be something that is of a meaningful impact, and to recognize that we are purposeful and intentional in advance instead of trying to clean up later. For us, this specific part of it really flowed out of some very intensive diversity discussions that we had 2 years ago. And a lot of the staff members said, well, wait a minute, while we're talking about these issues, we need to look at how we portray people of color who are, whether, no matter how you define it, in these booking photos tend to be people of color, and how fair is that? And so that was really when we began doing it. And the recent announcement of an actual policy change was sort of, in a good way, after we had already begun to move down that trail. It is related to how we deal, as you mentioned, with sunsetting items. In 2015, which is when the Tribune bought the suburban newspapers. It's a number of weeklies as well as 4 dailies. We realized we had about 27 different ways of dealing with these things. And a lot of them were small items. And that is why, to standardize it, we said, well, we're going to take a look at these. We're going to do police blotter items, and they will disappear after 30 days. There's an interest in them, a legitimate public safety interest. It's a fair thing to do, but these are not items that we are going to cover over the long term. So they have short-term value. They're reasonable to use in that limited way, but they need to only be there for a certain amount of time. And then in looking at that, we started to look at other stories. And so I think, as we get these requests, we have moved a long way from where we were 10 years ago, when the default was, oh, we don't unpublish things. Well, that's still the default on a lot of things, but I think we need to really be fair, take a look. And in some cases, for some of these older articles and some of these photos, we'll take a look, and maybe the answer is it deserves a follow-up, or maybe it deserves a different attention. But these are all things that we would have not even considered, didn't even think about 10 years ago.
Right. And one of the things I'll point out too in your policy that I really appreciated was you also discuss how the mugshots should be used, like where they should be, how big they should be, that kind of thing, if they're used as lead art or not. So I thought that was very nice to put some parameters around that as well.
We were victim, as many people were, to the technical things of platforms. Yep. And the platform would dictate that, oh, if you run this story, you have to run this mugshot. And so here, what would have been less overwhelming, a small booking photo, is suddenly there in like filling your screen, which only exacerbated the fairness issue.
Right. Okay, so moving to Greg, well, I'm sure we'll come back to all of that, but moving on to Greg, the Boston Globe obviously made a splash and advanced this conversation significantly when you came out. I guess, has it been about a month ago or so?
January, late January, yeah.
Late January, okay, time flies.
Yeah, it does.
when you announced your Fresh Start initiative. And I was curious because it was fascinating reading. I loved your FAQs and the information that you provided to your readers and the public about it. But you kept your options very, very broad. That, you know, you have basically said we might, you know, unpublish, we might delist, we might anonymize your name, right? So you've left yourself a lot of leeway. And one of the particular things I was fascinated about was you said that you would prioritize crimes that were a year old or more. And that is, it stuck out to me because that is the least amount of time that I have seen anyone say that they would start to, you know, consider these. And the specific quote that I think I mentioned to you that I pulled out of what you, of the Q&A was people's lives aren't static, they're dynamic, right? So what do you think that means for the nature of digital news content? So is it not the first draft of history anymore? Will there not be that permanent record that we typically think of?
Well, I think that as Margaret mentioned, in terms of the dynamic of we used to do this before, so why not the default position? And given that, look, we've changed and evolved with all the aspects of the digital revolution in our industry, and we have to look at all aspects of how digital impacts our lives in our business. And what we mean by that statement is that, you know, digital moves so fast. Same thing with someone's life. Their life still have to go on. And if it's something that may have happened a year ago and it's resolved itself, and depending on the degree of, you know, we have a standards list of the degrees of what we would decide if we decided to unpublish. And if it's because if it's someone who's, for example, trying to get a job or is trying to do something else. I mean, for example, you know, we are managers and we do hire people, and I can just type up someone's name in Google and call up real quick. That's instant. That's instant judgment on someone because we can do that. So I think based on the timeline of only 1 year is similar to what we do every day because digital is like this, and we can't have that same standard if you're waiting 5 years, 10 years, because your life have to move on. If it's something that is not you know, that meets our standards of was it a minor crime where was there a conviction where, you know, so your life shouldn't stop just because of that. So I think that's why we decided to go with that timeline because, you know, everything moves fast in digital, and we move fast when people make decisions on possibly hiring someone by, like I said, searching for them on Google because it instantly happens and their life can change just like that. So that's why we did that.
Right. Okay. One follow-up to that too, because I know this is something that I get asked a lot from newsrooms, and it's about the either paperwork or how to, you know, ensure that someone is telling you the truth, right? My charges got reduced or the case got expunged, that sort of thing. And so most newsrooms, of course, would love if every individual came with their paperwork in hand, right, to provide it to you, but that is often not the case. And Allison and I have had some crazy conversations about how difficult it can be for the newsroom to have to go back and do that kind of work. And I did notice in your FAQs that you said, if you can't, then we will do that for you. So that's a resource issue, especially for smaller newsrooms. Do you have any advice of how other newsrooms might handle that, or the volume that you might anticipate is going to come through and the work it's going to take on your newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, we realize that every news organization have resources that we do in terms of running a background check, but we also we also recognize that this is important work that has to be done. We have many people on our staff we have committee members that are judging these. So we have a stack of people in our newsroom who has volunteered to do this. So hopefully that probably one way of doing that, if you have a staff who can help with this to help, do this, but not, for example, we have a rotation of people. For example, you're on a committee, you could be in a committee for 1 year. You do this work for 1 year and then someone else cycle out on the staff to do this. So if you So one way of doing that is with newsrooms, smaller newsrooms, maybe you can rotate out your community people to actually do this work. Because it'll be impossible to ask anyone in the newsroom to do this for 5 years, so to speak. I would recommend doing it on a rotational basis and try to utilize resources that way to help find, do these background checks on this important work, because you want to make sure that you cover your bases if we make just as an important decision as this. So I would suggest trying to set up with your staff a rotational basis in terms of people making a decision. I think we have 10 people on our staff now who are actually going through. No, actually, we have a dozen, and right now going through cases. And right now we have 4 groups of, 3 groups of 4, and we all meet as subcommittees, and we get our caseload and we go through the process. So I would.
Wow. That's
So
a
yeah,
lot.
I had my
cases.
caseload. I had my caseload, and so we started that process already. And look, before we did all of this, we talked to a lot of community leaders. We talked to a lot of legal people in the community on how we should do this. So it was with a lot of consideration and thought, and speaking out to our external partners, because there's a lot at stake when we make decisions like this. So we want to try to be inclusive of everyone and making sure we cover all our bases when we do these things.
Great. Okay. Well, every bit of this leads us to Chris Quinn, who, again, Chris, you've probably been writing about this publicly for the longest. I think the first column I saw you write was maybe in 2018. And you've gone all the way from that first column saying we don't unpublish, right, with First Draft of History, to being a leader in the effort to come up with a more equitable way to handle unpublishing requests. Because one of the challenges, of course, is we typically now are only responding to the people who raise their hand, right, who contact us. And a lot of people don't have knowledge, agency, means, whatever it is, to contact you. So can you talk a little bit about how your program has progressed since you started it, and also your exciting news about your grant from the Google News Initiative?
Yeah, I think the first time I wrote about this was in 2015 as a trial balloon, and got back a lot of resistance. So we didn't move on it then,
Yep.
but it was the beginning. And look, this is about this. When people talk about the first draft of history, that's still there. That's still in the microfilm. All this is about is restoring the order that existed before the internet and search engines. Our stories, when we'd write about minor crime years ago, would appear in paper, they'd disappear and be forgotten within weeks. And the only way you were going to find them is to go looking through microfilm, or if somebody had an index. There was no ability to type a name onto any screen and get them. That's all this is about. The information is still available to anybody that has the know-how to find it. It's just not immediately available. And what this really was about for us was the harm we're doing to members of our community. I mean, we just kept getting letters from people saying, you're wrecking my life. I've moved on, I made a mistake, and it's all because of you. It's the only place that still exists. And we stood on tradition like everybody did until we couldn't anymore in good conscience. So we started a committee, we started to do this. It was getting attention because we were being very transparent about it. Right off the bat, as soon as we started, we were asked, hey, don't you think the mugshots you run perpetuate racial stereotypes? We had never thought about that, because we always, if you got a mugshot, you ran it. It immediately set us back on our heels, and we immediately changed our policy back in 2018, where we'll run a mugshot now for a murder or a public official, but not for anything else. We also stopped including names in stories involving minor crimes, because those aren't really about the who, it's about the what. And so why set up a future issue for somebody to have to deal with? So move ahead to Google. Google has provided us a bundle of money for a proposal we have to try and proactively sweep through our archives and identify all of the universe of stories that we might want to do this with. In part to really get rid of the bias that we know is going to be in there, because police are the source of crime news. And we know police have long been biased. And so as long as we're reporting what the police are giving us, we believe we've included that bias, not intentionally, not with any deliberation, but looking back now, you think we've got to do something about that. So this is hard. This involves scraping all of the local court dockets to get every case so that we can compare that to the stories in our archives. And we just finished the census of those. In Cleveland.com alone, there's like 1.4 million pieces of content that we have to sort through using big data. We're trying to identify all the photos that would be booking photos, which is not easy because they're not tagged that way. So, you know, it might be the distance between the pupils of the eyes and things like that. A lot of programming going into this to try and do it. One of the things we're really aiming for, we're pretty certain that if you looked at the plea agreements going back over time in the courts, that people who might have been charged with a felony at the beginning, we believe there'll be a difference in the way Black defendants and white defendants ended up. So using the court disposition for us isn't quite so helpful if that bias exists. So we're trying to get beyond that and understand that as we go in to remove stories. Because if you decided, let's just remove all the misdemeanors, well, that means all the white defendants that were charged with felonies that ended up with misdemeanors would be gone. But Black defendants who did the exact same thing, who didn't get the plea agreement, would still be in your archives, and that continues to bias. The last thing that's part of this project is we're trying to arrange so we get notified when people seek to expunge their record. Once it's sealed, it's a felony for anybody to tell us that. So there's not much we can do about the ones that are done, but we're hoping that we can arrange a line of communication with each of the courts. So when the application is made and it's still public, we can know about it, go in and give it our treatment at the same time before it's ruled upon. So a lot of stuff. And at the end, we hope it's a tool that you can take to other newsrooms if you're so inclined.
Absolutely. Yeah, tech has to be part of the solution, right? Just in New York and the states that have started expunging low-level marijuana requests, I know there's been some great columns by public editors written that say, we're not ready for this, right? From an unpublishing perspective, we just can't handle that kind of volume if we all of a sudden start getting dozens of requests a day to unpublish an old crime report. Okay, so we're going to turn to questions unless anybody on the panel has anything to follow up on what anyone has said. All right. So one of our participants wanted to go back to something that Greg touched on, and this is a huge issue, and that is conversations with legal about this. And specifically, the participant is asking legal ramifications of removing content and the subjective nature of doing so. And then, Chris, this is something that you and I have talked about. How are you ensuring that the process for removal is being applied evenly and fairly across the board? And as a follow-up to that, I will ask you, are you tracking that somehow? So,
well, we are not tracking it intentionally, because if we kept a record, it would allow a reversal at some point, and we're not. Once we give somebody this what they've asked for, we would hate to have that taken away. Look, we've got a great legal attorney. I think he's on this, Rich Bernstein, and we've talked to him throughout this. We actually, what we've learned, and I think others have learned, it's very hard to apply a uniform policy to this because every case is different. We've tried, and we have some general things, like generally it's got to be 4 years old, although there are exceptions to that. And we won't do public figures, we won't do rapes, we won't do murders. There's certain kinds of crimes we won't consider. But we get so many requests that are very, they don't categorize well, that I think it would be very hard to have that objective set of criteria. Our experience is that there is no objective set of criteria that could work.
I'd like to add to that. I have lots of contact with our legal department, lots of contact. And we channel all the requests through me so that we're consistent on this. And I get back regularly with the editors and so on, but also with the legal department, because we do talk. Is this something that's going to set a precedent that could cause us some trouble later? We talk about that. But then it really is to some degree subjective. So the default does on a lot of these general longer stories is still that the default is that we are not going to unpublish stories, but we'll have conversations about them, and I'll get back to people.
Great. Greg,
Yeah,
I think that
go
person was asking you specifically, and I am curious because I'm sure you had many a conversation before you came out with your policy.
Look, as everyone mentioned, this is all subjective because every case is not the same. Every situation is not the same. It's just be very hard to categorize everything in one thing and then apply something to another, because every case is a snowflake. And we speak to our legal team about this to make sure, as Margaret mentioned, if we don't want to set precedents. We always just try, at the end of the day, we're just trying to make the right decision based on a case by case, and making sure that anyone who's involved is treated properly. So it could be whatever subject matter is, we treat it as that case, because, like I said, everything is just so subjective, but everything is different. It's just hard to apply one size fits all to every case, because it's different. Every case, every situation is different.
Right. And I push back on that a little bit. Frankly, we had this conversation a little bit, Chris, I think the other day on the call, just because journalism prides itself on its standards, right? That's part of where the profession draws its professionalism from. And we know the public expects it. In fact, I did a survey of journalists in 2017, and about 65% believed that it was not okay for journalists to have separate policies, diverging policies on publishing. So isn't every policy built with a little bit of leeway in it? Like we have a lot of policies for things, but we understand that there's some wiggle room in them. So do we really not believe that some of this could be handled with some basic standards? Because I'm not convinced that we can't. That's my goal. I'm actually working with an organization to do so. So
you create guidelines. I mean, you try to fall within your parameters of your own guidelines. And I think that's probably why with the Globe stay broadly, so we could stay broad, so it could be flexible in how we handle these situations. So you must have guidelines, just like we have guidelines in our principles of journalism. So I don't think we go in there blindly, but you have to have a set of guidelines. But I think flexibility is critical too as well.
I think we'll get there. I think it's too new. The journalism ethics that we all subscribe to weren't developed in a couple of years. They were developed over time. And what I'm excited about as this is spread, I know what our newsroom has struggled with these requests the last 3 years. I want to see how my colleagues across the country deal with it. And hopefully through this, I mean, I think this is the first actual public forum about this topic that I know of. So this is the kind of thing we need to get to a set of best practices, but I don't think we know enough yet because it's so new.
Right. And I will say on that note, I've had a lot of conversations about this, about transparency and the like, and I am so, encouraged by news leaders like you coming out and talking about this, because what I have found during my research is a lot of people were doing it, but frankly, they just weren't admitting it. Some of the organizations who even said, we absolutely do not publish, I have it on good authority that yes, they do. Some of them will even track it down in LexisNexis or something like that. So so I do think transparency and more discussion among the industry is really important. And again, I've got a resource at the end I'll share that hopefully will help do that. But we got another question. Explain the thought process behind removing mugshots, but not text. And I'm curious, I don't know that anybody's saying that you don't also remove the text. If it's justified from a news standpoint to remove one, isn't it justified to remove the other? What's the rationale?
Well, in our case, that there's no distinction. What we're trying to do with the mugshots through the Google funding is just sweep them out of the system. There's no reason to keep them in there. But we don't discern when somebody makes a request to have their identity removed. it's wholesale. If we grant it, and we probably do 8 or 9 times out of 10, it's everything. There's no identifying factor that remains.
Okay. Yeah. And just on that note, one of the many technological issues that get into this, in the beginning, I think people thought this issue was very black and white and it's anything but, right? But I know too, often mug shots versus the text can cause more problems in Google search results. And Allison, you do something really nice for people often who, you'll follow up and say, just in case what we have done doesn't get this out of Google cache, because again, mugshots sometimes are a little more difficult than photos. Here's
Right.
information how you can follow up with Google, correct? And we're adding that to the resources that we're going to make available. Yeah.
We have found that often images hang around in Google Cache longer than stories. So when we removed our mugshot galleries, I got many emails and calls from people who were so thankful we had taken this step, but were still concerned about the fact that if you Googled their name and you hit images under Google, their picture would still pop up. And so, I just created an email that I send out to people telling them ways you can ask Google to remove their mugshots or their headshots. And Google is pretty responsive to it. There's a couple of different routes you can take. I even have like the snail mail way, because I had a couple of people who told me they didn't actually have internet access and they would have to actually write and mail a letter to Google. So I try and send that out. And I do that now if we tell people that we're unpublishing something, I send that with the email letting them know we're unpublishing something, just in case this still hangs around. Here's how you can manage it.
Right. Great. Okay. This is a great question. Somebody has asked, we've been asked to unpublish everything from wedding announcements to foreclosure notices. And this, we all know, yes, this is not just about crime, because they impact people's lives and show up in searches. How do we explain one set of rules for crime content and another for other content? And this is fascinating because some of this gets into, was it a paid wedding announcement? Is it advertising? That sort of thing too. And sometimes this is for good news. There are times when people will ask you to unpublish something that seems positive, but they don't want it out there. So how would you describe your sets of rules that are non-crime related?
I'll go. We generally restrict the request to mistakes, but we've made some exceptions for certain categories. And one of them is, it's not engagement notices, but if you do a feature story on somebody having some wild engagement that makes it newsworthy, and then 4 years later they're divorced, and the first thing people find about them on the internet is that they had this failure of their romance, it's really crushing to them. So we've agreed to do that. I have not had a foreclosure request, so I'll be interested to hear if others have.
No, I haven't. I had the relationship one. On my caseload, I had someone who you call up and they have a new relationship, and you type in that person who when they're date would type up their name, and their fourth name in the search is they went on a date with someone else. and it's one of those things that, look, we had to make, as you said, this is all evolving. We're still all learning, because the crux of this is that we're looking at the crime part, the mug shots. And now we're getting other things like this. So I think this is going to be an evolution. And these things will be considered too as well, because yes, they do have negative effects on people because they try and move forward with their lives. So I think as this goes along, I think we will we'll consider these type of things too as well to expunge, because like I said, this is evolving. But yeah, I never had foreclosures. We haven't seen foreclosures, but we have seen the relationship type ones.
And if I could jump in, we've had requests like across the board, not just for crime stories. The majority of our requests to unpublish are from crime stories, but some of them are. One of them was from someone who said, I was quoted in this story several years ago as, supporting the Affordable Care Act, and I no longer support it. Can you remove my comment? And we've had a bunch of, failed weddings, failed engagements. I don't mind taking those down, because they're not, those are things people submit to us because they want us to publish. That's not journalism. Those are just announcements about people's lives. So I don't have a problem with that. But we've had a variety of, we had a guy who wanted a photograph removed a feature photograph we took of him because he didn't like it, and he had lost a bunch of weight since the photo was taken, and he thought it was unflattering. I mean, we've had just a huge variety of requests that are outside of crime stories. And so we've tried to, our committee that looks at unpublishing requests has kind of tried to weigh them all against the same standard. And I think you have to do that.
We don't do wedding stories, wedding announcements, but we do advertising runs, paid announcements. And you know, our take there is they paid for it. It's their space. They have the right to take that down. You know, everything else, we did used to run some basic court kinds of things, but we don't do that anymore. And it was something, that listing kind of thing that we had purchased through the service, and you know, that expired, so we don't have that anymore. I think we've been spared some of those kinds of difficult decisions because everything has evolved, and some of that just took care of itself on its own. It's rare for us to get some of those.
And typically I have found that, oh, I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Could I offer one limiting? The reason we use that mistake standard is because it helps avoid some trouble. I heard from another newsroom of a case that I'm glad we didn't have about an adoption. 14 years ago, this woman adopted a kid, had a big story done. It was big and joyous. Now the kid's 14 and she wanted the story taken down so he wouldn't know he was adopted. And that's a tough one, because who are you doing this for, the mom or the kid? And we would have been able, I think, to say, look, we can't handle that. It doesn't fit into our standard of we're trying to correct or help people get past mistakes generally. Because otherwise, does anybody who asks for anything to be taken down get taken down? I mean, I do think you need to have some limits.
Well, I know I chuckled, Greg, because in y'all's Q&A and the Globe's Q&A, you said we will consider everything. And I thought, oh goodness, you're getting ready to get an onslaught, I bet. You know, I mean, I know of all across the board issues, some ridiculous, some, you know, some very serious. And typically we have categorized Kathy English, who is the public editor of the Toronto Star for years and years, and I call her my unpublishing mother. She's where I got started in my research. She has, oh, I'm so sorry. I just lost my train of thought. That's awful. What'd you say? Oh, she had said that, no, I lost it again. Go ahead, Greg.
Because yeah, we accept everything. We'll read it, but it doesn't mean we're going to change it or we're going to give a positive response for them. Because I know there was one case that we ran a story that ran this last year about someone losing their job, and it was very public, and they thought that the person who lost a job wanted to remove that story because it impacted their career. But we looked at the story, and it's like, you could impact other people, and it's not just about you. So we still have to use judgment in terms of what's the news value of this, and if it has news value, if it doesn't have news value. So we accept it. We just didn't want to put a limit on what can be submitted.
Okay, and I remember what I was going to say. Source remorse. That is what Kathy English had kind of titled I said something willingly to the paper, and now I would like to not have that out there. And in my research with journalists and with the public, that is the type of request that is least supported. You know, most people feel like you did it on the record.
You said it.
Now, children are an issue. I've talked to education reporters who have had this problem where they did a story on poverty and a child was named, and now they've come back and said that's kind of embarrassing. I would like it out. And this one education reporter I talked to was really torn up about it because her editor said no, and she felt responsible, right? So yeah, so this tears people up, and that's not something to discount either. Allison, I know we've talked about the safety. People get so passionate about this. You've had someone come to the office, correct?
Yeah, and one thing about the children, I haven't faced this, but I know of another newspaper that had a situation where a child was in a story and the parents consented, but they came back years later. The child came back years later when they were an adult and said, I never would have agreed. And it was something that painted the child in a really bad place, in a bad manner. And the newspaper just took the person's name out of the story. They left the story, but they said, like a teenager who did this, who had this accident. And so I think that's a good solution. But yeah, we had somebody who came to the office and said we had ruined his life. He was arrested and charged with rape. And, he claimed we ruined his life and was very threatening to one of my coworkers. And then he came again. And then like the next week, the pandemic happened and the building's been shut since. So I don't know if he's tried to come back, but he refused to go through like the normal process. And that's sort of concerning. And I think that it's interesting to me that, and it sort of speaks to the dilemma we're in. He doesn't blame the police officer who arrested him or the person who accused him or, the district attorney who charged him. He blames the newspaper for making this public. He kept saying over and over again, you have ruined my life. You are preventing me from getting a job. My child has been taken from me and it's your fault. And, so I think that speaks to part of the problem here is that, there's a lot of steps to someone ending up in the newspaper, but we're the people who, in the minds of people who've been arrested, the journalists are the ones who keep that crime alive. And this particular person's case has not been adjudicated. So it's really too early to decide what to do about it, even if he sort of came through the proper channels. It's tough.
I think the children thing is really a reminder to all of us to think more on the front end. Before you even publish it, think more clearly about why are we doing it and what purpose does it serve. There again, we had some stories from several years back before we got more attentive to this. And we've had to look at like taking down photos, especially with minor children. Mm-hmm. I mean, we should be protective of their right to have some control over their identity in the future. And so where we might have routinely in a real estate story said, here's Sally Smith with her daughter, whatever. So we don't name that child anymore. And we're even more careful about whether we would even use the image. And I think all of those things, things that we used to take for granted, we cannot be that capricious because right now, one of the tech advances is people can identify faces. And so, not identifying them in a caption is not thinking about what might happen in 10 years.
Right. It really brings up a discussion of informed consent as well. I've had that discussion with a lot of people. Do people understand that this is going to be around in perpetuity when they engage with the media voluntarily, at least? We got another question. I think we've covered part of it, and it's kind of discussing policies and guidelines for crime coverage moving forward. Who's not running mugshots? Are you only writing stories about violent crimes? And have you discussed, and this is interesting, that this means you will be writing drastically fewer stories? And they asked what the best practice was for updating a police report when a case is expunged or charges are dismissed. Do you remove the name? Do you put an editor's note at the top? What do you do?
Well, we put a note on the top of the story. Anytime we alter a story, we acknowledge it and explain the reason why. We will be writing fewer crime stories, but I have fewer crime reporters. So we were kind of writing fewer crime stories anyway, is sort of the truth of it. And there, some of this has just sort of happened naturally because having fewer people who cover crime, we don't tend to cover the minor things the way we used to, but we were very intentional about, my newspaper covers 13 counties in Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. And if you get arrested in DeKalb County, Alabama, the sheriff's office will send over a press release. And we used to just throw all of those online. We used to write it up. And so somebody who got arrested for having meth in their car in DeKalb County, Alabama would get their name online forever in the newspaper, you know, and easily searchable. But somebody who got arrested in any of the other like 12 counties in our area would not end up with the same treatment. And that's just not fair. And it's something we did for a long time without thinking about. And you know, when we sat down and looked at revising our pre-coverage policies, press releases were one of the first things that we, you know, we have to be really careful about. Just because somebody sends us a press release, we're not going to write up a crime brief. And we also have considered, we've also considered putting at the end of crime stories, and we haven't started this yet, but putting a sentence that says that says all suspects are innocent until proven guilty in court. Arrests and charges are merely accusations by law enforcement, and unless a suspect is convicted of a crime, it's something along those lines to sort of explain, like, this is an arrest is an allegation, and it hasn't been proven at this point. And again, we haven't done that yet, but that's something we've considered. We also just things in the past that we did, like if there was a big prostitution bust, for example, we would name all of the prostitutes who were arrested, and the Johns would never be named because they typically weren't arrested. They were, you know, I mean, there's plenty of customers of prostitutes who don't end up in the paper because these stings happen in a way where, you know, that person's in law enforcement. And so, you know, some of those might still be newsworthy, but maybe we won't list the names of the people who were arrested. We'll just say, you know, there was this sting and they arrested X number of people for prostitution, if it's a high number or if it's somehow newsworthy. And we just have to be really, we've become more intentional about discussing these things on the front end, and understanding that we were going to have guidelines, but every story is different, and we have to discuss the newsworthiness of every story. And we're leaning away from writing about misdemeanors, but sometimes a misdemeanor is newsworthy, and you have to be able to make exceptions, but explain why and be able to defend that. You know, I come at every single one of these decisions. I think if somebody calls me, you know, a year from now, how will I defend this? Can I defend this? And that's kind of how that's sort of my like guiding principle for how I make these decisions.
Great.
Can I add one thing about the whole notion of revising previously published stories? That is one that really depends upon your own state and what your state's libel laws are and what the nature of that story is. In our state, in Illinois, if you revise a story, the libel clock starts again. So if it's just a feature thing and there is no legal risk, well, then we wouldn't be concerned. But we would be very careful. And in that case, if we thought it merited more coverage in some way, we would work with the digital staff to do the keywords and the search and the meta titles in such a way that that item was published with the first one ahead of it, so that that's what they saw. But we would be, and again, this is not for everything, but we are careful about that.
And that's a technological question too, because I know in the beginning, a lot of people were asking maybe, you know, to update the article, that kind of thing. But then people started realizing that like that might re-timestamp it. It might up it in Google search results. And so often now people are saying, you know, don't update the story. And I've talked to news editors who then feel a dilemma of, well, now I know I've got inaccurate information, you know, so I've got to do something with it. But there is that potential for re-exposure, right? If your technology doesn't allow you to kind of, you know, not show that as new content, so to speak. Okay, we've got another one, and this is a great one about who is responsible in your newsroom. When this first started, we saw that a lot of these calls were just going to the editors, right? And you were likely having to make decisions. And in 2009, when Kathy English wrote her first report about unpublishing, one of their recommendations was to establish a committee, like you were talking about, Greg, that brings a lot of people to the table. And I have said in these, I've said in one in the Chattanooga Times Free Press, Allison, and yours, and it's fascinating to hear the various perspectives that get brought up. So do each of you have committees, or how is your decision-making process made?
We have a
have
committee of
editors, and it's the editors just because all of us are tight on resources, and that's the most convenient way to do this without draining a lot of staff time. So we get together every month, every 6 weeks, and go over the cases. And like I said, it's 8 or 9 of 10 we approve, because we basically have one standard: is the value to the person making the request greater than the news value to the community of maintaining it as it is? And almost always it's much greater to the person making the request.
So we have a committee of 5 people, and one person is from the newspaper, but outside of the newsroom, because we wanted a perspective of a non-journalist. And we picked 5 people because it's an odd number, and we have sometimes pretty animated debates, and then we vote on something. At the end of the day, I feel responsible for these decisions, and I like as the chief editor, and I contact the people and explain our decision.
And Greg, I found your comment earlier interesting. You rotate people, correct? So no one's got the burden.
Yeah, we haven't gone through the first rotation, but we discussed that how we're going to handle this in the future, because it's just, again, it's just a lot of work, and we have a lot of people who were involved in this initiative. So everyone wanted to participate, and it's also good because in newsrooms, previously we probably didn't have a lot of perspectives. Now we have perspectives from different type of people in the newsroom. They try to have as many eyes of different perspectives to make an informed decision. So it's good that we have this committee, but we've also know that, for example, someone may leave the newsroom and go to another job. So how do you backfill that? So that implement now on the front end a rotational basis would keep our efforts, staffed well enough to do the job we need to do when things are submitted.
That's great. Each one of you has touched on something, and we actually, I think we mentioned it earlier, about transparency with the public. And one of the things that I often hear from newsrooms that I'm trying to encourage to establish and maybe publish some basic guidelines, or at least talk about it, right? Because they're likely doing it anyway. There's been a lot of reluctance to that in the past, and obviously your organizations are leading the charge with being more transparent to the public. But what I typically hear is that is only going to invite more requests that we don't want to handle. So how would you speak to that, Greg? I'm assuming that you've been flooded. It sounds like if you've got 4 working groups or whatever, then maybe you've gotten quite a few requests. But can you speak to that? Have you seen, when you hung your shingle out, so to speak, that you've gotten inundated?
Yeah, we've seen it, but we also understand like the guidelines we have. If it's great, is it more importance for the subject, or is it for news value? So we use those principles. And look, anyone could apply, but like I said before, it doesn't mean that you're going to get expunged. We have to weigh all the factors. We do a background check. We'll do where's there a conviction? Where's there a minor crime? Was it did your actions actually impact others? Because it's still a lot of stakes. So people can apply, but doesn't mean mean that we're going to get rid of you. So we accept all incomers because we feel that if we don't, then we're going to, like I said, that scrutiny is going to come. So we're going to have a fair eye at everything, but at the end of the day, they know that we still have to make a decision. So, but at least on the front end, we're not discriminating people from applying. So at least from that standpoint, we have no scrutiny from that part. But on the back end, they actually realize they still have to go through a process, and the process might not automatically favor them, but at least they had a chance to apply.
Right. Well, as expected, this hour has flown by and we need to wrap up. So very quickly, I think Rachel's going to throw a screenshot up. I just wanted to let you know that as part of my work here at Reynolds Journalism Institute, we just launched a website dedicated to this issue. It's unpublishingthenews.com. And I wanted to point out a couple of things to you about it. We are collecting policies across the industry. Anybody who wants to either submit even an internal policy, and we can scrub your information, your newsroom's information out of it if you want it to be anonymous. But right now we've got about 60, I believe, in there, just from policies that we knew about that were already existing out there on the web. But we really would like to build that repository because it's important to see across the board what's happening. To your point, Chris, we now can see kind of the momentum across the industry. We've also got an editors forum set up. So that's where please continue this conversation. I, in particular, want to use this website and the feedback that I get to guide my research and my work with newsrooms. So definitely please use that. Let us know what's important to you and what you need. And there are people out here who are willing to help. And then the last thing is there are some newsroom tools, and those are things that people have created. I'm creating several tools, some with Allison, some with other newsrooms right now as part of my fellowship that will be added. And I'll be creating others in partnership with newsrooms, and we'll be adding anything that anyone else creates that they want to share. So again, this is a new resource. I really hope it works for you and becomes kind of a hub to have this discussion and to move us forward. And I'd love, again, your feedback. We will have a link in the follow-up email that Rachel will send you that links to a post on the website that has all the panelists' policies, links to your content and the like there, so panelists can go and peruse more details about your policies. So I think that wraps us up. Thank you so much, panelists. This is the first of many discussions, I believe, that we will have on this. And this is a great one to kick us off. So thank you.
Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.